my focus on Filipinos specifically, and where this came about, is I was sitting in a graduate conference room. I said, well, you need to do your dissertation on Filipinos, Filipino Catholicism. And I thought, well, surely somebody else has done this. There's such a large population. They're so important. They've done so much, not just for the community, but for faith and Catholicism in this country. Somebody's got to have done it. And it's like, I tell you what, I'll give you 2 days. You go find all the research on Filipinos, and if you can find enough that you don't think you need to do anything, then I'll leave you alone. So he calls me in 2 days. He goes, what did you find? And I'm like, I didn't find anything. And he goes, it's really sad, isn't it? This is a very important population that nobody knows anything about, but you do, and now it's your job to make sure everybody knows. So to give you the story, though, I went home from my office in the University of Texas, Morris, people understand why we should care about Filipinos. Oh, why should we care? What's the big deal? Oh yeah, I know a Filipino. My local priest is Filipino. Why are they important? So if you will forgive me, I'm going to give some of that background so that I can give you what I tell my colleagues in immigration, why we should understand the importance of Filipinos, and then I will slowly get into faith, slowly get into understanding the importance of Filipino priests to the future of the Catholic Church. Next slide. If you look at the demographics here, again, some of you may be very familiar with this. The details of this, I've sent the PowerPoint to Father Urel, so you're more than happy to have it. Much of this has been submitted to the subcommittee. The USCCB has it. In fact, I was very tickled when I walked in and I saw this on the table this morning, and I'm like, depending on how we count and look at different Asian populations, Filipino Americans are the 4th largest immigrant population in the country. And I say depending on how we count, because some surveys will count differences in terms of how we count Chinese Americans. We're looking at Taiwan as being a part of mainland China in these surveys. Obviously, if you're Taiwanese, you've got a problem with that, right? And we as scholars get that. But what I'm saying is that on all charts, it's at least 4. In some cases, it's higher, as in 3rd or 2nd largest immigrant population in the country. 69% of the Filipino American community is foreign-born. That's important. People ask me all the time, why do you study foreign-born Filipinos? Because that's the majority of the community. The 2nd largest Asian American community in the United States, 44% growth from 2000 to 2010. I say that percentage because that's a little bit lower than what it was right after 1965 when legislation changed, but it is still one of the largest growths in populations that we see in this country. If you look at the citation here from Fred Cordova, he says that Filipinos are the forgotten Asian American population. So within community circles, within academia, within those of us that do research, we all recognize that there is importance of this population. But for one reason or another, people have taken Filipinos for granted and have not studied them. Looking at this alone, just these numbers, you can see where this is a growing population, a vital population. And if for no other reason, if I said nothing else today, people have to study Filipinos because they're a major growing part of the American landscape. Next slide. Kids that no longer are that size. And the one that's sitting on the bench turned around and had to shave. Everybody focuses on Latinos. Latinos, 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 Latinos. Well, the 2nd largest is specifically Filipinos. And Filipinos, is the data that I'm going to show you, are remaining Catholic, where many Latinos are not. Okay? 2nd highest church attendance amongst Asian Americans, and that church attendance is measured as weekly or more. Okay? 2nd highest participation in church beyond worship service. This is an important measure. So you can have your parishioners who show up and they go to Mass, and maybe you know or you don't know whether they are truly living their faith, whether they believe But this date is even more important than just attending Mass because it shows that your parishioners are coming and they're staying and they're active and involved in the church beyond Mass. That's important, right? 43% of Filipino Americans state that they came to the United States for family reasons. Family is important to the community. 56% of Filipino Americans are currently married, and that is higher than the national average. The divorce rate is lower than the national average. So you can understand that faith and family are very important. We're talking about a very religious people. You know this. You know that family is very important because those two things form the cornerstone of the community. It is having a profound effect on the church. This longitudinally, how have you changed, or if you've changed your religion? And if you look at the data specifically, and I put the arrow here for Filipinos, you see that Filipinos have a fairly high retention rate, meaning that Filipinos who were raised Catholic stay Catholic. And I say that because that's important. The hottest thing in studying from the academic side for us right now is looking at the switching of Latinos from Catholicism to Protestant faith traditions. And I always get asked, well, you study Filipinos. Are the Filipinos doing the same thing? And the answer is no. To some extent, because this happens, right? But for the most part, Filipinos are staying Catholic. And that's a very important point to make. This is some data from the Filipino Houston American Survey done in 2010. That is part of my book, the States, early 1900s. Fast forward to 2000, the Catholic Church is now once again the largest single religious denomination in the country. Why is that the case? Largely because of immigration. And I told you, the second largest source of immigration in the United States for Catholicism is Filipinos.
Yes.
So why is the church now the largest denomination in this country? A large part of it has to do with Filipinos. As the church grows, you know this, the church needs what? Priests, okay? And priests are in short demand. So you see here, 50% decline in the number of priests, young men entering the priesthood here in the United States. Young men in the United States largely are not becoming priests. It's not happening that much. So that how do we take care of the people that are in these communities? If we don't have American-born young men becoming priests, well, what do? You import your priest. Right? And I say that because there is an increased need for foreign-born priests in the American Catholic Church. All the data that I've looked at, y'all may have better numbers to inform me, please let me know. But the number that I get is about 800 Filipino priests in the United States today. Right?
Yes.
And it's important to note, a lot of people ask me, like, oh, when you study Filipinos and you speak to a Filipino priest, is that Filipino priest serving in a Filipino parish? No. They're largely serving multiracial, multi-ethnic parishes. Right? So we're not talking about that old 1900 model where you had the church growing because of the Irish and the Poles and the Italians, and you had Irish and Polish priests coming in and serving in parishes that were just like them. That's not what's happening now. As this country grows, as the Catholic Church grows, you have Filipino priests who are starting to fill that need, and a large part of that has to do with linguistic ability. Okay? Next slide. What's this now? You may be familiar with this. You may be able to tell more than I'm telling you this morning about this. But so much of what's happening in the Philippines is a hollowing out of a very rich barrel. If you understand what I'm saying. We talk about this in terms of brain drain. The best and the brightest and the most educated nurses and doctors and engineers all leaving the Philippines. Right? Because of the circumstances in the Philippines. Everybody's leaving. What people don't talk about is the fact that it's also priests who are leaving the Philippines. So that as the world needs nurses and doctors and engineers and a host of other folks, they also need priests. Sadly, now in the Philippines, where there is a preferred ratio where most of the archdioceses would prefer one priest to 2,000 parishioners, which to me, as a professor, I can imagine my class is 2,000 students. I'm just saying. Good morning. Wow, that's a lot of papers to grade. That's the preferred ratio. The ratio right now in the Philippines is one priest to 20,000 parishioners. That's a lot of papers to grade. Okay? And I say that because in order to talk about the context and the importance of Filipinos to this country, we also have to recognize what is happening to the Philippines as a result of us benefiting from your presence here. Right? Do you understand what I'm saying? The United States needs priests. The Philippines has a lot of them, but not anymore, because we're all taking them. So it's an important context to understand that, because there are Filipino priests everywhere in the world. My mother-in-law just got back. You know, she went on a holy tour. She came back. She's like, I was so impressed. And I'm like, what struck you? I mean, what inspired you? And she's like, everywhere I went, there were Filipinos. Excellent. Serving churches in English, Spanish, and Filipino languages. When I was working for the USCCB, part of the National Asian American Study for Asian Pacific Island Catholics, it was astounding to me. Some of my colleagues are like, okay, you're going to go to a Filipino parish. That's kind of what you do. And I'm like, there aren't Filipino parishes. There are a few, right? I mean, it exists. And I'm like, so I would go somewhere and I would watch a priest give stacked masses. You know, there's a mass at this time, and a mass at this time, and a mass at this time. And I would always wait for the changeover of the priest, but it never happened. So I would get in a month where I would get to the church, the mass was in Spanish, and it was a Filipino priest. And then there was a 5-minute break or so, and then mostly Latinos in the audience. Then a break, and then a new group of people would come in, largely Anglo, and the Mass was in English. And in the time that I watched, it was that special time of the month where there was a Tagalog Mass. They left, the Filipinos came in, and it was all the same priest. You know, the priest came to me and he's like, do you have any questions? And I'm like, yes, are you tired? You need more breaks, you know. But I say this because there are unique and beautiful things that are happening. You could say, oh yes, Filipino priests, because of their linguistic abilities, are able to serve multiple communities. But what's important to understand is that they're bringing communities together. Because there are experiments that I have seen in my research across this country where they said, you know what? I'm going to speak in English, in Spanish, in Tagalog, Sign, whatever it may be, all at the same time. Let's have one Mass. Let's bring everybody together. Sometimes there's no room, okay? But there's this interesting thing that happens when they try to do these things where you see all of a sudden where there's these stacked masses where people may not be interacting as much out in, hi, how are you, good morning, bless you. When you have part of that, the Philippines is the most colonized country in the world. Everyone has tried to rule the Philippines, including Filipinos. And it's a sad history. It's a bloody history, right? But what came out of that is beautiful. What came out of that is an expression of appreciation and ease with many cultures. Well, this is the way that we do it. Okay. This is, okay. Okay. I'm saying? Yeah. Okay. See, I know you get it. So that there's an ease there that's a little bit different in terms of this is the way we're doing it. Do you understand what I'm saying? So there's an ability to adapt. There's an ability to have an ease and a fluidness across people, to be able to work with people and to bring people together. Right? Right? And that says something about you. It also says something about the leadership that you provide. So when you're looking at the impact of Filipino priests, it's not just on the parishioners, but it's also on the church. The church needs you. The church would not survive without you. That is a statistical fact. If all of you, I do this in class, we take a population, we take immigrant groups, and we say, okay, pretend that they don't exist. What would happen? If you do that with Filipinos, churches wouldn't be open, hospitals wouldn't be open, buildings wouldn't be built, on and on and on and on and on. So you have to understand the importance to the church, and you have to understand the importance of a gathering like this. This is the third gathering, am I correct?
Yes.
Right? You were gaining momentum. You were coming together as a group because, I don't need to tell you, you recognize your importance. Am I correct?
Yes.
Otherwise you wouldn't be here. You wouldn't be organizing. Oh, just whatever. No, you know because you organize. Hey, we matter to the church. We should get together, we should talk about it. No. It changes the racial and ethnic landscape of the church. As I said, so when we talk about the church serves all kinds of different people, well, part of that all kinds of different people is you, right? Their faith and culture is inspiring others. Their leadership across communities is bringing communities together. Often you will find a Filipino priest who is really the only neutral voice in their parish, which I imagine is going to be a very difficult job, right? It's like, okay. You look at this, second and third generation, I'm not going to let y'all off the hook here, because I wouldn't be a good scholar if I didn't ask you to do some work for me, right? We don't know what is happening. We have some work through the USCCB work that I've done for the subcommittee. We know a little bit about what's happening with second and third generation Filipinos, but there has never been a national study